The morning Winifred Hale counted her wood was a quiet morning, the kind that Fortune's Reach had learned over the years to overlook entirely. The sky above the Colorado mountains was a pale gray gold, not yet decided between night and day. The aspens along the ridge had already turned their leaves trembling in colors so vivid, they seemed almost to be arguing with the season, unwilling to let summer go. Below them, the town of Fortune's Reach slept on its chimneys, beginning to breathe their first thin columns of smoke, its mud-packed main street as still as a held breath. But on the eastern edge of town, where the land flattened before it met the fence line, Winifred Hale was already awake and already working. She stood before the barn, as she always stood before it, straight-backed, unhurried, her gray hair pinned at the base of her neck, her hands loose at her sides. She wore her husband's old work coat over her dress, the leather gone soft and dark with years of use, and her breath made small clouds in the cold air. Her lips moved without sound. She was counting. 2 goats, Nell and Bess, old as the decade, and calmer than most people Winifred had ever known, lay at her feet in the dry grass. They did not raise their heads. They had seen this before. They would see it again. 16 cords of hickory and oak stacked in the crosshatch pattern she had learned from her father, who had learned it from a man he once worked alongside as a young carpenter. That man had come from somewhere far and cold, somewhere Winifred only ever thought of as the place with the gray island cliffs. He had shown her father how to lay the logs, so they crossed each other like the fingers of folded hands, leaving channels between them for the air to pass through freely. He had told her father only one thing about why it mattered. He said a man who seals his wood from the air is sealing his own fate. Winifred had been 12 years old when her father passed that line along to her standing beside the first cord they had ever stacked together. In that pattern, his hands guiding hers to place each log at the correct angle, explaining what the channels were for. Why air was not the enemy of heat, but the condition of it. She had been 23 when she first understood. It truly understood it in the way that you understand a thing, not because someone explained it, but because you have finally seen what happens when it is ignored. She had been 33 when her husband Joseph died in a flood and left her alone on 60 acres with nothing but a grief she could not speak aloud, and a memory of a man who had laughed at her worry that same morning. She counted the cords again. 16. Good. Fortune's Reach in the autumn of 1888 was a town that believed in itself completely. Gold dust had made it. The railway running 2 days' ride to the south had made it permanent. A decade of mild winters and good harvests had made it arrogant. The main street was wide enough for 2 wagons to pass each other without trouble, and the storefronts along it had real glass windows. Peck's General Store had a sign painted in gold letters, the paint still bright. The bank was built from stone. The hotel had a second floor and a dining room with tablecloths that were changed twice a week. Mayor Calvin Morse had lived in Fortune's Reach for 20 years, and in those 20 years he had grown to resemble it. He was a broad man with a broad voice and the particular kind of confidence that comes not from wisdom but from never having been seriously wrong about anything he considered important. He wore his watch chain across his vest, like a general wears a medal. He shook hands with both of his, covering the other person's completely. He laughed loudly and often, and the sound of his laughter had a way of settling questions before they were fully asked. Winifred Hale was not by any measure the town used to success. She owned 60 acres that had never produced gold. She had no husband, no children, no business that anyone could identify. She had a cabin that was considered too solid for its size, a barn that was considered too large for what she kept in it, and a reputation that had curdled over the years from eccentric to peculiar to something closer to quietly unsettling. People were polite to her. Fortune's Reach was a polite town. But there is a kind of politeness that is really a form of distance, and that was the kind Winifred had received for 30 years. She did not appear to notice, or if she noticed, she did not appear to care. That, more than anything else, was what made people uneasy about her. Joseph Hale had died in August of 1858, 30 years before the story that mattered. He had been 35 years old, and full of the easy certainty that comes with being young and healthy and not yet tested by anything that truly counted. He was a good man in most of the ways a man was expected to be good in that time and in that place. He worked hard. He was generous. He told the truth more often than not. But he laughed at Winifred's worry. That was what she remembered. Not his face, not his voice, in any particular moment of tenderness, but the laugh. It had been a warm laugh, fond even the kind a man gives a woman he loves when he thinks she is being unnecessarily frightened of something he has already decided is not worth fearing. The river had been high for a week. The snowmelt from the peaks had come late and heavy that year, and the water in the creek that crossed the lower edge of their property had been rising since June. Winifred had watched it every morning. She had measured it against a stick she pressed into the bank, and she had noted how each morning the watermark climbed a little higher, and she had told Joseph more than once that the creek was going to cross its banks before the summer was done. He had kissed her on the top of her head and called her his little worrier. On the morning of the 14th of August, the water came. It did not rise slowly. It did not give warning. One moment the creek was a creek, and the next moment it was a wide brown mussel moving fast across the lower field. And Joseph was in that field. They found him 2 miles downstream, caught against the root system of a fallen cottonwood. Winifred did not cry at the funeral. People remarked on this as people do when a widow holds herself together in public, and some took it as coldness and some took it as strength, and none of them understood that it was neither. It was simply that the grief had gone somewhere inside her that was too deep for crying. It had settled into the bottom of her chest like river silt, and it had stayed there. And it had hardened into something she would spend the rest of her life building around. She stayed on the property. No one expected her to. She was 33 years old, childless, with 60 acres and a modest pension, and no particular reason to remain in fortune's reach, except that she had decided somewhere in those first weeks of silence that she was never going to be caught unprepared again. Not by a river, not by a season, not by anything the world decided to throw at her without the courtesy of a warning. The barn had started the following spring. Winifred did not hire a contractor. She could not have afforded one even if she had wanted to, and she did not want one. She wanted to understand every piece of it, every joint and brace and beam the way you can only understand a thing when your own hands have put it together. She ordered lumber from the mill in the next town over, negotiating the price herself, with the kind of focused calm that made the mill owner think afterward that he had perhaps given her better terms than he intended. She borrowed engineering books from the county surveyor, a man named Francis Hartley, who wore spectacles and smelled of pipe smoke, and was surprised and then not surprised when the widow Hale asked him detailed questions about load-bearing ratios. The frame went up over 2 summers. She hired day labor for the heavy lifting men who came and went without asking questions because she did not invite them. The rest she did herself. The planking, the roofing, the interior walls of the animal pen, the small reinforced shutters on the high windows designed to close from the inside with an iron bar. By the 3rd year, the barn was standing and she had begun to fill it. She started with the wood. The wood was the foundation of everything, and she was meticulous about it in a way that her neighbors found baffling, and her own instincts found completely obvious. She did not collect wood the way most people in Fortune's Reach collected it, which was to say, opportunistically, and with no strategy beyond having enough to get through. whatever winter they were currently facing. She curated it. She paid extra for hickory. She paid extra for seasoned oak. She turned away greenwood and resinous pine, no matter how cheap, because she had learned from her father that the wood you burned in a crisis was the wood you had chosen long before the crisis arrived, and choosing meant quality over convenience every single time. And she stacked it the way her father had taught her. The crosshatch pattern came back to her clearly in those early years, the way childhood lessons rise to the surface when they are finally needed. She could still see her father's hands moving, crossing the logs over each other, explaining in his quiet way the principle the old carpenter from the Gray Island had passed to him. Air moves through those channels. It takes the moisture with it. Wood that breathes stays strong for years. Wood packed too tight rots from the inside before you ever notice something is wrong. She stacked the first cord in that pattern, then the second, then the third. By the 5th year, she had enough wood to heat her cabin through 6 winters. By the 10th year, she had enough for 10. The food came next. She had preserved food all her adult life, as every woman of her generation had. But she had done it without strategy before Joseph died. Now she did it with the same focused intentionality she brought to everything else. She planted her kitchen garden not to supplement her meals but to supply her stores. She put up glass jars by the 100, peaches in syrup, green beans in brine, pickled beets swimming in dark vinegar, spiced apple butter smooth and amber-colored, the smell of it filling the cabin every September for 30 years running. She bought in bulk from Warren Peck's store in town, the same as she always had. Except now, she watched his expression as she set her orders on the counter. He was a young man in those early years, not yet in his 30s, with the easy manner of someone accustomed to being well-liked. He smiled at her and said things like stocking up for an army, and she would nod and pay and carry her purchases to the wagon without elaborating. She did not need him to understand. She needed him to fill the order. The shelves in the barn grew heavy. The rows of jars multiplied season by season. She built additional shelving with her own hands, measuring twice and cutting once, the way Hartley had taught her to think about structural decisions. By the 15th year, she had enough food stored to sustain herself through 2 full years of failed harvests. But it was not only food, it was medicine. This part came from her years as a midwife, those long decades of moving through the homes of Fortune's Reach at all hours, bringing life into the world, and sometimes easing its departure, learning which plants did what, and which combinations worked when the doctor's bag was not enough. She had dried willow bark for fever. She had pungent herbs for chest congestion, the kind that settled into the lungs in winter and turned dangerous if left untreated. She had poultices and tinctures and small packets of things with no names she used in general conversation, only names she used when she needed them in the dark. She kept this part of her stores in a wooden chest with an iron clasp. It was not secrecy. It was inventory control. In the autumn of 1883, 5 years before the winter that would change everything, the town council of Fortune's Reach held a special session on the subject of the widow Hale's woodpile. The complaint had come from a man named Percy Sloan, who owned the property adjacent to Winifred's fence line on the north side, and who had decided after years of what he called tolerating the eyesore that the stacked cords visible from the road constituted a violation of what he referred to in his written petition as the aesthetic standards of our growing community. Calvin Morse, who was already mayor by then and already fond of administrative decisions, convened the session on a Tuesday afternoon. There were 4 council members present. The vote was 3-1. The fine was $15 for what the official notice described as a wood storage arrangement in violation of community appearance ordinances. Winifred received the notice on a Wednesday morning. She walked to the council office that same afternoon, paid the $15 in cash, folded the receipt into her coat pocket, and walked back out without speaking. The clerk who took her money said, "Have a good day," out of habit. Winifred nodded at him without slowing. Then she walked to the lumber yard on the south end of town, arranged for the delivery of one additional cord of seasoned oak. And when it arrived 2 days later, she stacked it herself by hand, in full view of the road in the crosshatch pattern she had learned from her father, directly on top of the existing pile. Calvin Morse drove past in his buggy that afternoon. She did not look up. He did not stop. The fine was never levied again. By the golden October of 1888, Fortune's Reach had decided collectively, and with great conviction, that the worst was well behind it. The gold had peaked. It was true, but the ranching had taken hold, and the ranching had brought money of a steadier kind. The railway connection to Denver meant that goods arrived in days instead of weeks. Families who had come west with almost nothing were now thinking about expansion, about piano lessons, about whether a second floor was practical or whether they wanted practical at all given the times. Warren Peck had replaced the front of his general store with a single pane of glass, nearly 4 feet wide, the largest window in Fortune's Reach. The kind of window that was primarily a statement about where a man stood in the world. It caught the morning sun and threw it across the main street in a long, bright stripe, and people walking past it slowed without meaning to, drawn by their own reflections. Winifred walked past it every time she came to town for supplies. She never slowed. Abel Marsh arrived in Fortune's Reach on a Tuesday in late October, moving on foot from the direction of the North Road, which was the direction nobody useful came from at that time of year. He was a lean man, somewhere near 60 if you estimated by his face, though his body moved like something younger with the kind of economical precision that comes from living outdoors for decades. His beard was gray and close-cropped. His coat was heavy canvas, well worn at the elbows. His eyes were a pale color that you noticed because whatever was behind them was doing more work than eyes usually do. He went directly to Peck's general store. It was mid-morning, and there were perhaps a dozen people in the store or near it, gathered around the iron stove or moving between the shelves. Warren Peck was behind his counter. Calvin Morse happened to be there, as he often was, because Morse conducted most of his social business from wherever the most people were likely to gather at any given moment. Abel stopped in the center of the room. He said he needed a moment, and something in the quality of his stillness made the room give it to him. He said the animals in the high passes were gone, not moving south. Gone. The squirrels had burrowed to depths he had not seen in 40 years of watching them. The elk herds had left the upper meadows 3 weeks earlier, and they had gone in a direction that made no sense for a normal winter migration. The air at elevation tasted like iron. There was a pressure in the bones of anyone who had spent enough time in this kind of country to learn how to read it correctly. He paused and let the room be still for a moment. He said this was not a storm coming. This was a season of winter arriving all at once. The room held its quiet for perhaps 5 seconds. Then Morse laughed. It was not a cruel laugh. It was the laugh of a man who was completely comfortable, which is sometimes the same thing. He said something about old trappers and cold breezes. He said something about the almanac predicting a mild November. He said it with the warmth of a man who enjoys being the one to put worried people at ease, because putting people at ease is a form of power, and he had always understood that. The room relaxed into his laugh the way rooms do when the most important person in them has decided what to think. Abel Marsh's face did not change. He said he had seen elk frozen solid standing upright in a high mountain meadow. He said they had not had time to lie down. Someone in the back of the room made a quiet sound. Morse said, "Abel, you have spent too much time alone with the mountains. We are grateful for your concern." Truly. But Fortune's Reach has stone buildings and men who know how to prepare for a winter season. Abel looked around the room for a long moment, taking in each face in turn, the way a man takes inventory before leaving a place for good. Then he picked up his pack from the floor, settled it onto his shoulders, and walked out the front door of Peck's General Store without looking back. The bell above the door rang once. Then it was still. The room began talking again within 30 seconds. Winifred had not been in the store that morning. She heard about it from old Hartley, who had been there and who stopped by her fence line on his walk home to tell her what had happened. Not because he was alarmed by it, but because he thought it was an interesting piece of news, and she was a person who received his reports without interrupting. She listened to the whole account standing at her fence post with her hands in her coat pockets. She said, "Thank you, Francis." He tipped his hat and walked on. She stood there a while after he left, looking at nothing in particular, thinking about an elk standing frozen in a high meadow, its legs locked beneath it. The cold having arrived so fast that the animal's last instinct, the instinct to remain upright, had been perfectly preserved, like a thing pressed between the pages of a book. Then she went back to the barn. The counting was already done. She knew every number, but she walked the length of the barn again anyway, touching the shelves as she went, the way a person touches a railing on a familiar staircase. Not for balance, for confirmation. Everything was where it was supposed to be. The jars, the sacks, the extra wicks wrapped in cloth, the locked chest, the spare rope coiled on its hook by the door. She was near the back of the barn, checking the iron ring on the hanging lantern, when the barn door opened behind her. She did not turn around. She said the latch sticks. You have to lift and push at the same time. The man behind her said, "I noticed." She turned then. Abel Marsh stood inside the door, his pack still on his shoulders, his pale eyes moving slowly across the barn, the way a person looks at something they have been trying to imagine for a long time and are now measuring against reality. He said he had been traveling for 2 years. She waited. He said, Dakota Territory, the winter of '86. You will have heard of it. 200 people in a town called Reedy Falls. 4 days of blizzard. They had nothing stored. No real provisions. The kind of town that kept expecting to resupply before it got serious. He paused. He looked at the rows of jars on her shelves, reading the colors through the glass. He said, "I was the only one who came out." Winifred was quiet for a moment. She asked how he had survived. He said, "I had a root cellar and a bad leg that kept me from leaving when the others tried for the ridge. That was all. No preparation. Just a bad leg and a cellar with barely enough in it to wait out 5 days. Nothing like this." He looked at her. He said he had been walking from town to town ever since, not running from anything. Looking for something specific. Looking for someone who had prepared on purpose, not by accident, not out of fear, but because they understood something the rest of the town was not willing to look at directly. He said she was the first one he had found. The 2 goats, Nell and Bess, had come through the inner pen door, drawn by the unfamiliar voice. They stood near Winifred's legs and regarded Abel with the calm, sideways assessment of animals who have been around people long enough to have formed opinions about them. Winifred studied Abel Marsh for a long moment, long enough that a less steady man would have shifted his weight or said something unnecessary to fill the silence. He did not. She said the tool shed at the back has a bunk and a small stove. Wood is already in the bin. You are welcome to it as long as the weather holds, and after that we will see what needs deciding. He said, "I will not be a burden." She said, "No, you will not." She turned back to the lantern ring and tested it once more. He picked up his pack and went to find the tool shed, without asking which direction it was in. Nell and Bess watched him go. Then they turned back to Winifred and waited. Across town in the back office of Peck's General Store, Warren Peck sat at his desk and opened the bottom drawer for the fourth time that week. The telegram was there where it had been for 10 days. It had come from his main supplier in Denver, a careful man named Rollins, who moved goods through a wide network and who had connections in the meteorological offices that Peck had never questioned too closely. The telegram was brief because telegrams always were, but the words in it had been sitting in Peck's chest like river stones since the first morning he read them. It said there was a weather system building over the northern ranges, unlike anything the instruments had recorded in 30 years. It said suppliers were holding back their October shipments until the system resolved. It said that anyone in the affected corridor who had not made arrangements for an extended disruption should make them immediately. Warren Peck read it one more time. He thought about Rollins and his tendency toward caution. He thought about the almanac and its mild November. He thought about the Christmas buying season, the final weeks of the year that carried a quarter of his annual revenue. And what would happen to that revenue if the town learned there might be a supply problem before the holidays arrived. He closed the drawer. He went back out to the counter and smiled at a woman who had come in for thread and sugar. And he told her it looked like a beautiful autumn, and she agreed that it did. And the bell above the door rang when she left, and the afternoon continued in Fortune's reach, as afternoons had continued for years. By the last day of October, Winifred had completed her final accounting. She moved through the barn in the early evening with her lantern in one hand and her notebook in the other, and she checked each item against the record she had kept for 30 years. The small leather notebook with its cramped columns of numbers that she replaced when it wore out, which it did every few years. She moved through it all with her usual steadiness, the cords of wood, the jars and sacks, the lamp wicks, the spare rope, the medicine chest, the candles pressed over the summer. She checked the seals on the food barrels by running her fingers along the pitched rims in the dim light, reading them by touch the way she had read things in the dark for most of her adult life. She inspected the iron flue on the cabin stove, testing the damper and listening to the quality of the draft. Then she checked the cowl. This was the piece she had designed herself with Hartley's help and his engineering books. A rotating cap at the top of the ventilation shaft she had built into the barn roof, designed to turn with the wind, keeping the shaft clear and drawing air through the interior, even when everything else was sealed shut. She had adapted it from an illustration in one of Hartley's books, a drawing of a mill from somewhere in the British Isles, or perhaps somewhere older still, and she had built it herself from salvaged copper and a set of bearings she had ordered specifically for the purpose. She tested the rotation with a pole from below. It moved freely. Outside, the wind was doing something she had not heard before. Not exactly, not in quite this way. For the past week, it had come from the northwest, with the melancholy moan she associated with late autumn. A sound that was not quite winter and not quite the end of something else. A sound that contained a question in it. Tonight, the question had been answered. The wind was no longer asking anything. It was saying something low and certain in a register below what she could clearly identify, but above what she could comfortably ignore. The temperature, already cold all day, had dropped another degree or two in the past hour, and the quality of the cold had changed. It was no longer the cold of a season ending. It was the cold of something else arriving altogether. In their corner of the pen, Nell and Bess stood pressed together, sides touching heads lowered. Winifred looked at them for a moment. Then she went back inside the barn, walked to the wall where the rope was coiled on its hook, and measured out 3 lengths with her hands. She tied the first to the barn door ring. She ran the second from the barn door to the post nearest the water well, doubling it back so there was always a line in each direction. She tied the third between the barn door and the cabin entrance. Then she brought the extra kindling in from the wood store and stacked it beside the hearth. Then she sat down in the wooden chair by the stove, pulled the old wool blanket over her knees, and listened. Across town there were lights in every window. She could see them through the small glass pane of her cabin, warm and golden, the way the lights of a ship look from a different ship on a dark sea. She could hear carried faintly on the sharpening air the sound of a fiddle high and bright against the growing weight of the dark. She knew what it was. Warren Peck had arranged a gathering at the saloon, an occasion to laugh together, about the old trapper's warnings to pour a glass, and celebrate the mild November the almanac had promised. She had heard someone had bought an expensive bottle of wine for the occasion. She sat in her chair and listened to the fiddle. She watched the lights. She let her breathing slow the way it always slowed when a decision was already made and there was nothing left to do but be ready for what came next. The wind found a new note before midnight. It had been a sound. Now it was something that moved against the walls of the cabin, with intention testing the joints, reading the weaknesses, learning the structure the way a flood reads a riverbank before it decides where to go. Winifred did not move from her chair, and in the complete dark of the barn, pressed together without space between them, Nell and Bess stood perfectly still and waited for the morning that would not come the way mornings were supposed to come. The storm arrived the way a truth arrives when it has been suppressed for too long. Not gradually, not with any courtesy of warning. At 2 a.m, Fortune's Reach simply stopped being the world it had been the night before. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in 10 minutes, not in the slow, progressive way that autumn temperatures drop, cooling degree by degree across the course of a long, dark night, giving people time to feel it and pull their blankets up and drift back into sleep without quite waking. This was a different kind of cold. This was cold as an event, cold as a thing that happened to the world all at once, cold that arrived with the complete and indifferent finality of a door slamming shut in a house you can no longer get back into. The wind came with it. It had been building for hours, cycling through its registers in the dark, while the town slept, moving from the low moan Winifred had heard in the evening to something higher, more mechanical, more purely violent. By 2 a.m, it was no longer a sound that belonged to nature in any familiar sense. It was a physical pressure, a sustained assault on every surface it found, and it found them all. It read the gaps in door frames. It tested the seals around window glass. It found the chimneys and drove itself down into them with a force that extinguished every open fire in Fortune's Reach inside of 40 minutes. The first snow was not flakes. It was ice crystals, fine and sharp, moving horizontally at a velocity that made them indistinguishable from the wind itself. They scoured the wooden faces of the storefronts. They packed themselves into every crease and joint of the soil. Within an hour, the world beyond any window in Fortune's Reach had ceased to be a view, and had become a wall, a uniform, roaring, white-gray wall with no edges and no depth, moving so fast that looking at it too long made the eyes ache. Inside the livery stable, the horses had been screaming for 20 minutes before the roof went. The main support beam was older than it should have been for a structure of that size, because the man who built it had used the cheapest available lumber and trusted that mild winters would protect the decision indefinitely. The beam gave way with a sound that was less like a crack and more like a detonation, a single hard report that carried even through the roar of the storm and woke people 3 buildings away. The rest of the roof followed it down in a collapsing sequence that took less than 4 seconds, each section pulling the next one inward, the whole structure folding into itself with a kind of awful efficiency. The horses that could move got out through the gaps. The ones that could not were found 3 days later, 20 minutes after the livery roof went. The great glass window at the front of Peck's general store shattered inward. It went all at once. One moment it was there, flexing slightly in its frame with each sustained gust, holding the way glass holds when it is still trying. Then something changed in the pressure. A piece of debris moving fast enough that no one would ever identify it afterward, and the window was gone. The sound of it was swallowed immediately by the storm. The goods inside the store, the careful arrangements Warren had tended for years, the stacked cans and folded bolts of cloth, and the glass jars of candy that children pressed their noses against on Saturday mornings. All of it was hit with a horizontal wave of ice and wind and cold that moved through the store in an instant and left the interior a ruin of glittering fragments and frozen merchandise. The chimneys failed in their own way. The wind at that velocity did not simply push past a chimney opening. It created a pressure differential that reversed the draft, entirely driving air down the flue instead of drawing it up. Fires that had been built up against the cold were extinguished in minutes, and in some cases the downdraft drove smoke and ash and burning embers back into the rooms where families huddled. People woke to smoke and darkness and a cold that was already inside the walls with them. The town did not panic all at once. It panicked in sequence, household by household, as each family came to understand in its own time that the warmth was gone and was not coming back, and that what was outside the walls was not a storm that would moderate by morning, but something of an entirely different order. Some people moved to neighbors whose situations were marginally better. Some burned furniture they could no longer afford to save. Some stood at their windows and looked out at the white roaring dark and saw far out at the eastern edge of town, at a distance that should have been invisible in that weather, a single small amber point of light that did not waver and did not go out. Winifred was awake when the first knock came. She had not slept. She had sat in her chair through the long hours of the storm's arrival, listening to it with the focused, dispassionate attention she brought to everything that mattered, tracking its changes the way a physician tracks the progression of a fever, measuring each escalation, noting each shift in register, understanding each development as data in a sequence she had been anticipating for 30 years. When the temperature dropped, she put a second log on the stove. When the wind reversed the draft, she adjusted the damper to the position she had worked out through years of testing. In ordinary winters, the position that maintained the draw without allowing the downdraft to take hold. When the barn lantern guttered, she went out through the covered walkway and trimmed the wick and secured the shade against the draft. She was back in her chair when the knock came at the cabin door. She did not startle. She rose, set the blanket aside, and looked through the small peephole she had drilled in the heavy door panel 15 years ago. Outside, pressed against the door, was a shape covered in snow from head to foot. Behind that shape were two more smaller hunched together. She unbolted the door. The cold that came in with them was not like ordinary cold. It was the cold of a place that has given up on warmth entirely, air so far below freezing that it registered not as temperature, but as a kind of aggressive physical fact, pressing against every surface of exposed skin with deliberate hostility. It was Frederick Noyes, the doctor. His medical bag was clutched against his chest. His hat was gone. His face was the color of old chalk. Behind him were the Hartley brothers, Francis and his younger brother, Leon, both of them reduced to the same basic animal state of relief at finding warmth. Winifred stood aside and let them in and closed the door and bolted it again. She did not speak yet. She let them come back to themselves first. Standing near the stove, their hands extended toward it, making small involuntary sounds as the heat reached them. Then she went to the barn. Abel was already there when she got through the covered walkway, and he had already understood what was needed without being told. He had taken the guide rope she had pre-rigged from the barn door and was preparing to extend it using additional lengths from the coil on the wall working efficiently in the lantern light, with the precise waste-free movements of a man who has done dangerous work in the dark before. She said there will be more coming. Anyone who can see the light will come toward it. He said, I know. I will go out and bring them in. She watched him go, the rope trailing behind him, and she stood in the barn door and held the inner end of it and felt it move in her hands as he moved through the dark and the noise and the white erasure of the storm beyond the threshold. He went out 4 times in total. Each time he went farther. Each time he came back with people attached to the rope behind him. People who had been moving toward the light, or who he had heard calling, or who he had found by chance in the white, roaring dark between one building and another. He brought them in groups of 2 and 3 at a time. Men and women in various states of shock and cold. Some of them lucid, and some of them not. Some of them still wearing the expressions of people who had been at a party 3 hours ago and had not yet absorbed the distance between that world and this one. Warren Peck arrived with his wife Vera and his son Eli near the end of the 2nd hour. Warren's face was different from all the other faces Winifred had seen come through the barn door that night. The other faces showed fear, which was honest, and disbelief, which was understandable, and the raw animal gratitude of people who had just understood they were alive, when they might easily not have been. Warren's face showed something else underneath all of that, something compressed and interior, something he was managing carefully. His eyes moved to Winifred's and then moved away, and the movement was too quick and too deliberate, and she noted it the way she noted everything. She said nothing to him. She gave Vera a blanket and sent Eli to sit with the Hartley brothers near the stove and put Warren to work carrying water because work was the best thing for the kind of discomfort he was carrying. By the time the last of them arrived, there were 15 people in the barn and the cabin combined. Among them was Calvin Morse. He arrived alone, without ceremony, without the broad voice and the gold watch chain and the comfortable authority. He arrived the way everyone arrived, which was to say, diminished, stripped down to something basic and undecorated. His fine coat torn at one shoulder, his face deeply cold. He said nothing when he came through the door. He looked at Winifred for a moment, one long look that contained many things, none of which he appeared ready to say yet. And then he moved to the far wall and stood with his back against it, and stayed there. The barn held them all. It was after the last arrival had warmed enough to stop shaking that Warren Peck made his move. He had been watching the shelves from the moment he came in. Winifred had seen his eyes go to them and stay there, moving along the rows of jars, the stacked sacks, the careful abundance of 30 years of accumulation. And she had seen the calculus behind his eyes, the professional habit of mind that looked at a supply and immediately began computing distribution and control, and the particular authority that comes with managing what other people need. He said it carefully, framed as a practical suggestion rather than a demand. He said perhaps they should take an inventory of available supplies to ensure fair allocation for everyone present. He moved toward the shelves as he said it. Winifred stepped in front of them. She did not move quickly. She did not make it dramatic. She simply stood up from where she had been crouching beside the lantern and placed herself between Warren Peck and the shelves with the same unhurried certainty with which she did everything else. She looked at him. She did not speak. Abel, standing near the barn door, shifted his weight slightly and said nothing. The room looked at Warren Peck. Then it looked away. It was not a hostile looking away. It was the kind of movement that happens when a group of people arrives at a collective understanding without anyone having to articulate it. A turning of attention that signals clearly, and without cruelty, that the direction one person has pointed is not the direction the rest intend to follow. Warren stood with his hand half extended toward the shelf, and no one watching him. And after a moment he let the hand drop, and he walked back to the bale of straw he had been sitting on, and he sat down. Winifred let a moment pass. Then she turned to face the room. She said it quietly, but the barn was quiet enough that quiet carried. She said there were no mayors in this barn. There were no store owners. There were no positions and no prior authorities and no arrangements from the world outside that held any standing inside these walls. There were only people who wanted to live until spring, and if they wanted that, they would do as she said. She laid it out in plain terms. Food twice a day, a thin stew in the morning and a piece of bread in the evening, enough to maintain, but not enough to waste. Water from the well on a rotation, because the water was essential and retrieving it was dangerous, and the danger would be shared equally, regardless of who had come in with money in their pocket and who had not. 2 people on the rope at all times, one going, one holding. The rope was the most important thing after the fire. No one went outside the door without the rope. No one. She assigned duties before she finished speaking. The Hartley brothers for rope duty on the first shift. Noyes for tending the stove in the cabin. Abel for the barn. 2 of the younger men for water duty when it came time. No one argued. The first crisis came from above, and it came quietly. The barn had been holding warmth adequately through the first full day, the solid walls doing the work she had built them to do the stove in the connected cabin, sending heat through the walkway into the barn's interior, the animals adding their own body warmth to the ambient temperature in the pen. It was not comfortable. No one would call it comfortable. But it was survivable, which was exactly what it was designed to be. The second day brought something different. It began as a heaviness, a quality in the air that people noticed without being able to name, a slight weight in the lungs, an unusual desire to sleep at times when sleeping felt inappropriate. Conversations shortened, movements slowed. 2 of the men from the saloon sat with their heads against the barn wall and closed their eyes in the mid-morning, and this was not the behavior of men who were simply tired from a hard night. Winifred stood in the center of the barn and breathed carefully and recognized what it was. 15 people. A sealed space. 2.5 days of continuous occupation. The air was going thin. Not dangerously thin yet, but moving in that direction with steady, quiet purpose. And the reason was not the breathing alone. She went to the base of the ventilation shaft and looked up through it, and could see in the small circle of gray light at the top the silhouette of the copper cow, motionless. It had frozen. The cow was designed to rotate with the wind turning on its bearing, to always present the open face away from the incoming gust drawing air through the shaft by the low pressure created on the lee side of the cap. A moving cow created a passive breath for the interior of the barn, exchanging stale air for fresh without any active effort from the people inside. A frozen cow was a sealed tube. She went back to the center of the barn and looked at the people around her and calculated the hours they had before the air became genuinely dangerous. She estimated 6, perhaps 8, not more. She said the cowl on the ventilation shaft has iced over and stopped moving. Someone has to go up on the roof and clear it. She paused and she explained the principle the way she always explained things that mattered, without excess and without condescension. She said the cap was designed to breathe for the barn, the way the crosshatch pattern in the wood stack was designed to let the wood breathe. Her father had learned it from a man who knew things about sealed spaces and cold air that most people in these mountains had never needed to think about. A man who came from somewhere far and gray and cold, where the winters lasted longer than the patience of ordinary preparation. That man had said, a man who seals his wood from the air. is sealing his own fate. The same was true of any enclosed space with people in it. The shaft needed the cowl to turn freely. The cowl needed to be cleared from above. She said, "Abel goes up. The rest of you hold the line." Abel was already at the wall, lifting the longest pole from its hooks. They got him up through the loft hatch with a rope secured around his chest and run back through an iron ring in the center beam, held by 3 men with their weight leaned against it. The loft was dark, and the wind came through the gaps in the roofing boards. At that height, with a ferocity that was different from what they felt below, more direct, less filtered by any intervening structure, he worked by feel in the dark. He could not see the cow from below the roofline, but he knew its position from the shaft opening, and he worked the pole upward through the hatch until he felt it make contact with the frozen bearing housing. He pushed. The bearing held. He pushed harder, working the pole in a rotating motion, trying to transfer force to the ice without losing the contact point. The first time he found the angle, the pole slipped. The momentum of the slip sent his shoulder into the roofing board, and the board gave slightly outward. And for one moment, his upper body was through the gap, and the storm hit him directly. A wall of ice and wind and noise so total that the men below heard him make a sound through the boards. That was not quite a word, and not quite a cry, but something between the two. The rope held. They pulled him back. He rested against the loft floor for a moment, breathing hard in the thin, cold air. Then he said simply, "I have the position. Let me go again." The second attempt lasted 4 minutes. He found the angle. He worked the pole against the ice with a patience that seemed almost outside the normal range of what exhaustion permits applying pressure, in the small grinding increments that wore at frozen things rather than tried to break them all at once. He felt the giving before he heard it, a slight release of tension through the pole. He pushed again, another small release, and then the cap moved. Just once, a quarter turn, but a quarter turn was enough to prove the bearing was free. He worked it through 2 full rotations and then ran the pole through 3 more times in quick succession to make sure it had not re-seized. Then he let the men below lower him down. The air in the barn began to change within 2 hours. It was subtle at first, easier to feel than to confirm. But the heaviness lifted. People who had been drifting toward involuntary sleep found themselves alert again. The air in the lungs lost its thick quality and became simply air. Winifred said nothing about it. She put the next shift on rope duty and went back to the medicine chest. The second failure came from outside on the 3rd morning. One of the men, a rancher named Clifford Buell, who had been steady throughout, went out on the water rope before dawn. He had made the run twice already. He knew the line. He had the distance memorized in his body and the feel of the rope in his hands. What he did not know was that the rope had been moving against the corner post of the fence all night. Abraded by the ice crystals, the wind drove into everything it touched, wearing through its fibers in a place no one had thought to check, because it was underneath packed snow and invisible, and the weakening happened only in the dark. The rope snapped 6 feet from the barn door. The snap was nothing in the noise of the storm, but the change in tension was immediate, and the man holding the inside end felt it go slack, and knew. Clifford Buell was 12 steps from the barn door. In a world with visibility, 12 steps is a moment. In a world with no visibility and wind at the velocity of a sustained physical assault, and snow packed hard enough to erase every familiar surface and landmark and edge, 12 steps is a maze with no fixed points. He called out. No one heard him over the storm. He moved in what he believed was the direction of the barn and walked into the fence post and rebounded from it and lost his orientation entirely. He was outside for 11 minutes. He found his way back when Abel, who had taken one end of the emergency coil and gone out blindly in the direction of the last known position, found him by sound and by instinct, and by the particular spatial awareness that comes from decades of navigating in the dark, and brought him back through the barn door at the end of a line held by 4 people. Winifred was at the door when they came through it. She looked at Clifford and assessed him without speaking. His fingers were white. His face had gone past red into the pale stillness that preceded danger. She put him by the stove and put warm cloths on his hands and told him only to stay still. Then she went to the rope bin. She worked for the better part of an hour, rerouting the entire guide system with 3 ropes instead of 1 running them in parallel to the well, with the length staggered so that each one was tied to a different anchor point, and no single point of abrasion could compromise all 3 at once. The iron ring on the fence post was the first anchor. The water trough frame was the second. The corner post of the barn extension was the third. Each rope ran to a separate cleat on the inside of the barn door, clearly marked with strips of cloth tied at each end, so they could be identified by touch in total darkness. She explained the system to the people who would use it without drama and without excess. She said if one rope goes slack, you hold the other 2. You do not move past the second anchor without checking the third. You call out before you move past each point. This is not a difficult thing. It is a careful thing. There is a difference. The people who heard her nodded. On the 3rd morning, Eli Peck began to cough. He had been quiet through the first 2 days, the way children are sometimes quiet in situations that overwhelm adult coping mechanisms, sitting close to his mother, with his eyes tracking the room and the people in it. He had eaten his rations without complaint. He had slept against Vera's shoulder in the straw. He had not cried, which had made Winifred watch him more carefully than she might have otherwise, because a child who does not cry in frightening circumstances is either very strong or very unwell. He was not very strong. The cough started as a dry thing, the kind of cough that could be cold air or simple irritation. By mid-morning it had changed. It had gone from the surface of the chest to somewhere deeper inside it, somewhere that produced a wet sound with each cough, a sound with weight and resistance behind it. And Winifred recognized it, and something tightened behind her sternum. She went to Frederick Noyes. She said quietly so that only he heard, "The boy has fluid in the lungs. You hear it." He had already heard it. He had been watching Eli since early morning. He stood up and said he needed to examine the child properly. And when he had done so, he came back to Winifred with the expression of a man who has just confirmed what he was hoping he had not confirmed. He stood before her and looked at her steadily, and then he said it plainly. He said, "I lost my bag when the roof came down on the surgery. I have nothing. I know what needs to be done, and I have no means to do it." He paused. He said, "You have what I do not have. I believe at this moment you know more practical medicine than I have available to me. Tell me what you want to do, and I will follow your lead." For a moment, the rest of the barn seemed to recede, all 15 people, and all the noise and the slow press of cold from the walls, and it was only the doctor's face and the plainness of what he had just said, and the full weight of what it meant. She went to the chest. She unlocked it and opened the lid, and let him see the interior for the first time. The rows of folded cloth packets and corked vials and small wax-sealed jars. The 30 years of gathering and preparation laid out in an order that made immediate sense to anyone who knew what they were looking at. She lifted out the willow bark, first the dried strips of it that she had been collecting and replacing for decades, and set it on the workbench and told him to start the tea. She lifted out the chest poultice herbs, next the compound she had mixed from specific proportions she had refined over years of use at bedsides around Fortune's Reach. She moved with the deliberate economy of someone who has done this before and knows exactly what each minute costs. She told Noyes the quantities. She told him the timing. He listened without interrupting, which was the most useful thing he could have done, and when she gave him a task, he performed it without needing repetition. They moved Eli into the cabin to the small bed near the stove. Winifred brought Nell and Bess through the covered walkway and settled them in the corner of the cabin near the foot of the bed. Not as sentiment. As practical warmth, two large animals in a small room adding heat without combustion. A gentle and constant warmth that demanded no fuel. Noyes looked at them when they came through the door, and then looked at Winifred and said nothing, which she took as agreement. Vera sat beside the bed and did not leave it. Warren stood in the doorway between the cabin and the walkway and watched his son breathe with the expression of a man who is looking at something he cannot fix with any instrument he possesses. Winifred worked. She worked through the afternoon and into the early evening, alternating the treatments in the sequence she had worked out over decades, monitoring the boy's temperature, with her palm against his forehead and the back of his neck, the way she had done for every patient she had ever sat beside through a fever. His breathing was labored, each breath of visible effort, his small chest rising with an urgency that should not have been required of it. The barn outside continued its existence in the intervals between her attention to the boy. Abel managed the shifts. The stove was maintained. The rope system ran without incident. Morse took the late shift on the inner rope without being asked and held it through 2 hours of cold without complaint. And Winifred noted this as she noted everything. On the evening of the third day, Eli's fever spiked. Vera had been awake for 36 hours. The sustained sleeplessness and the fear and the sight of her son's face in the lamplight, pale and working so hard for each breath, had worn through whatever composure she had been holding together by effort and force of will. When Eli's temperature rose and his breathing changed in a way that made Noyes look up quickly, something in Vera simply gave way. She did not cry. She had been crying at intervals for 2 days and had moved past it. What came out of her was not planned and not aimed at anyone in particular. It came from the interior pressure of too many hours of too much fear. And it came out shaped by whatever had been sitting at the bottom of her understanding since the night the storm arrived. She said, "Warren, you knew. You had the telegram. You knew 10 days before any of this came." The cabin went absolutely still. Warren did not speak immediately. He stood in the doorway and his face moved through several things in rapid succession. Things that, in another circumstance, he might have managed more carefully. But he was exhausted and cold, and his son was fighting for each breath, 4 feet away from him. And the thing Vera had said was true. He said yes. I knew. No one moved. He said it quietly with an almost clinical precision, as if precision was the only dignity left available to him. He said he had a telegram from his supplier in Denver. He said it had arrived 10 days before the storm. He said he had set it aside because he was thinking about the Christmas buying season. The silence that followed lasted a long time. Calvin Morse had been standing near the barn side door when Vera spoke. He was wearing his coat already prepared for his rotation on the outer rope. He listened to Warren's words without changing his expression. He looked at his own hands for a long moment. The broad hands he had always used so expressively. The hands that had clapped Abel Marsh on the shoulder and sent him out of the store, like a man shooing away something inconvenient. He did not say anything to Warren. He did not look at Winifred. He put his gloves on one and then the other, taking his time with it, pressing each finger carefully into place. He picked up the rope end from the cleat on the door. He said to Abel in a voice that held no particular expression, At all I will take the next 3 hours." And he went out through the door into the storm, and did not come back in until the first gray light of the fifth morning showed at the edges of the ventilation hatch above. Inside the cabin, Winifred sat beside Eli Peck through the long hours of the night. She changed the poultice when it needed changing. She administered the tea in small, careful measures when the boy could swallow. She adjusted the lamp wick. She listened to his breathing with the complete, sustained attention she brought to the things that mattered most. The things she could not afford to approach partially. Nell stood at the foot of the bed and did not move. Bess lay on the cabin floor and breathed slowly, and added her warmth to the room without asking anything in return, which was, Winifred thought, somewhere in the small hours of that long night, more than could be said of most of the people she had known. By the dawn of the fifth day, the wind had dropped by perhaps a quarter, not enough to call an ending. Not enough to open a door and believe the world outside would meet you with anything other than cold and white, and the same indifferent violence it had maintained for 96 hours. But the pitch of it had changed, the sustained high shriek dropping slightly towards something that sounded for the first time since 2 a.m. 4 days ago, like something that might eventually run out of force. Winifred heard it from her chair beside Eli's bed. She heard it, and she noted it, and she filed it as information. She put her palm to the boy's forehead, still burning. She replaced the poultice. She sat back down. Outside, the wind continued its long argument with the walls of the cabin, and somewhere above them in the dark, the copper cowl turned in the shifting air and drew the breath of 15 people outward and brought the cold, clean air of the Colorado mountains inward, because the bearing was free, and the shaft was clear, and the thing she had built was doing exactly what she had built it to do. She folded her hands in her lap. She watched the boy breathe. She waited for the morning that had not yet decided what it was going to bring. The silence came before the light. Winifred noticed it in the way she noticed most things, not all at once, but as an accumulation of small observations that eventually arrived at a conclusion. The wind had been dropping for hours, cycling down through its registers, the way it had cycled up 5 days ago, losing its high mechanical shriek. First, then the sustained roaring pressure, then the lower grinding note that had pressed against the walls like something with intention. By the time the gray of early morning began to show at the edges of the ventilation hatch, the sound outside the cabin had reduced to something that was almost ordinary. Almost the sound of a winter morning. Almost the sound of a world that could be walked through without a rope. She was still in the chair beside Eli's bed when it happened. She had not slept. She had dozed in the way she had learned to doze over 30 years of sitting vigil beside sick people. A shallow, suspended state that was not rest exactly, but was not full wakefulness either. A condition her body had developed for the specific purpose of remaining available without consuming itself entirely. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her eyes had been closed for perhaps an hour. She opened them when the quality of the silence changed, not when the storm ended. The storm had not ended cleanly the way storms end in stories. It had subsided degrees of diminishment spread across the final hours of darkness until, at some point between 3 and 4 in the morning, the last of its force had simply exhausted itself against the mountains and the plains and the small, stubborn structures of Fortune's reach, and what remained was the cold, which would remain for a long time yet. But the cold alone without the wind to weaponize it. Winifred put her palm to Eli's forehead. She held it there for a moment. Then she took a slow, careful breath. The kind of breath that is not drawn for oxygen, but for composure, because the information her palm had just received was information she had been waiting for through the longest night she had spent in 30 years, and she did not want to respond to it badly in any direction. The fever had broken. It had not broken dramatically the way fevers sometimes break in people with enough reserve strength to produce a crisis. A drenching sweat, and a sudden sharp consciousness. It had broken quietly the way things break when they have simply used up everything they were made of. The boy's forehead was cool and damp, and his color, which had been the gray-white of something losing its argument with the cold, had returned to something closer to the color of a child's face ought to be. His breathing was even, not deep, not strong still. The breathing of a body that had been working very hard for a very long time and needed rest before it could do anything else. But even, regular, not fighting. Winifred did not move for a long moment. She sat in the chair with her palm resting lightly on the boy's forehead, and she listened to the silence outside the cabin walls, and she let herself feel briefly and privately the full weight of what the last 5 days had contained. Not as emotion exactly, more as a reckoning, a counting of the things that had been spent and the things that had held, and the precise margin between them. It was smaller than she would have liked. Then she removed her hand and she stood up and she went to work. Vera Peck had fallen asleep in the straight-back chair on the other side of the bed, sometime after midnight. She woke when Winifred touched her shoulder, not because the touch was rough, but because Vera had been sleeping the way desperate people sleep, at the very surface, ready to surface at any change. She looked at Winifred first, because that was where the truth would be. Winifred said his fever broke. He is sleeping. Vera looked at her son for a long time without speaking. Then she pressed both of her hands flat against her face and made a sound that had no words in it. A sound that was not grief, but was made of the same material, the same interior pressure, releasing through the only opening available. Winifred stood and let her make it. There was no appropriate response to that sound, and she did not try to manufacture one. After a while, Vera lowered her hands and looked at Winifred with eyes that were very clear. She said, "I do not know how to repay this." Winifred said, "You do not need to repay it. You need to let him sleep and you need to eat something, and then we will see what the morning has in it." She went to the barn. The people there were already awake, roused by the change in the storm, the way animals are roused by changes in pressure. Some instinct registering the shift before the conscious mind confirmed it. They were sitting up in the straw or standing near the lanterns, talking in low voices, listening to the changed quality of the air outside the walls. When Winifred came through the covered walkway, she saw Abel first standing near the barn door with his hand against the wood, as if reading the temperature through the planks. He said without turning, "It is over." She said, "Mostly." He said, "The boy." She said, "He will recover." Abel nodded once and turned away from the door and went to the rope coil and began checking the lines for the morning, because that was what needed doing next. And Abel had always understood that the thing that needed doing next was the thing to do. Morse was in the far corner of the barn. He had come back in from the rope shift before dawn, and he had sat against the barn wall and had not slept as far as Winifred could determine, though his eyes were closed when she crossed the barn floor. She watched him for a moment without approaching. His coat was stiff with dried ice across the shoulders and the collar. His hat had lost its shape entirely. His face, even in the lamplight, had a quality of exhaustion that went deeper than physical fatigue, the kind of exhaustion that comes from spending many hours with yourself in the dark, with nothing to think about but the truth of things. She did not speak to him yet. She went back to the checklist that was always running in some part of her mind, the accounting of what remained and what had been used, and what the coming hours would require. There was enough food for another week if they needed it. The wood supply was lower than she would have kept it for herself alone, but it was adequate. The medicine chest was reduced but not emptied. The rope system was intact. What was needed now was different from what had been needed for the past 5 days. What was needed now was a door opened, She found the 4 largest shovels in the tool store, the ones she had hung on the wall specifically for this purpose, long-handled and wide-bladed, designed for moving snow in quantity rather than precision. She carried them to the barn door and set them against the wall. Then she went to the corner where Morse was sitting. She said his name. He opened his eyes. She said, "We need to dig out. It will take most of the morning. Are you able?" He looked at her for a moment from his considerable exhaustion. He said yes. She held out one of the shovels. He looked at it. Then he reached up and took it, and she pulled him upright with one hand, and he stood beside her in the barn, in his wrecked coat and his ruined hat, and they walked to the barn door together. It took 4 of them, working in rotation, nearly 2 hours to clear the drift from the barn door, sufficiently to push it outward. The snow was not soft. 5 days of wind packing had compressed it into something closer to the consistency of sand, heavy and dense, resistant to the blade, in a way that required force rather than technique. They worked in shifts, 2 pushing while 2 rested, and the pile they moved inside the barn grew waist-high before the door had enough clearance to swing. When it opened, the light that came in was extraordinary. Not warm, not gentle. The sun was still winter sun, positioned low in the sky, above the mountains, carrying light, but not heat. The kind of light that illuminates without comforting. But after 5 days in lamplight, in the amber and shadow of lanterns, and the dim grayness of the ventilation hatch, the quality of it was almost physical. A clarity so complete that it registered as something close to pain at the backs of the eyes. They stood in the barn door and looked at what Fortune's Reach had become. It was not the town anymore. It was the idea of a town preserved in white, the volume and outline of everything that had stood before the storm, but transformed, rounded, smooth, buried in some places to the roofline, and in others merely buried to the windowsills with drifts between the structures that had erased the streets entirely and replaced them with continuous rolling white that extended in every direction until it met the mountain slopes. Peck's General Store was a white mound with a dark hole where the glass window had been the gap collecting shadow. The livery roof was an absence, a collapsed flatness at ground level surrounded by debris half buried in snow. The hotel was standing, the second floor visible above the drifts, one of its windows broken. The church had its steeple still rising above the white surface like a landmark in a different geography. The sky above it all was a blue that had no name. Not the pale, uncertain blue of autumn or the soft blue of summer. A blue that was entirely resolved, that had made up its mind completely. The particular blue that appears in high altitude on still days in winter, after a storm system has swept all ambiguity from the atmosphere and left behind only clarity. The kind of clarity that has no mercy in it, but also no deception. No one spoke for a while. Then Morse picked up his shovel and stepped out into the snow and began to dig. He did not announce it. He did not frame it as a gesture or a statement or a moment of public accountability. He simply stepped out through the barn door and plunged the blade of the shovel into the packed snow at the threshold and began to move it, because there was a path needed between the barn and the town, and someone had to start it, and he happened to be the one with the shovel. People came out behind him and took up the work. It was slow and it was hard, and the cold that had been deadly at 40 below was merely brutal at 20 below, which meant the body could maintain itself sufficiently to keep working if it kept moving. They worked for 3 hours, opening a trench from the barn to the main street, shoulder width and navigable, the walls of packed snow rising on either side to above head height in the deepest sections. The people who were too cold or too depleted to dig stayed inside and tended the stove and watched Eli Peck sleep. And Vera sat beside him and ate for the first time in 2 days an actual meal. Winifred worked alongside the diggers for the first hour, and then stepped back and directed. She had a sense of the geography beneath the snow that the others mostly did not. Because she had walked these streets for 30 years in every season, and had a map of them inside her body that did not depend on visual cues. She knew where the road surface would be firm and where it would be soft over a buried drainage channel. She knew which direction to work toward to access the structures that were most likely to contain people who had not come to the barn. They found 2 families still sheltering in their homes, one in a root cellar beneath the hardware store, and one in an upstairs bedroom of the hotel with furniture burned down to the last chair leg. Both groups were cold and hungry and overwhelmed with a relief so intense it expressed itself as silence, as a complete inability to produce ordinary speech in response to ordinary questions. They brought them back through the trench and into the barn. By early afternoon, the community of Fortune's Reach had reassembled itself in its entirety in and around Winifred's barn, the living ones all of them accounted for with no losses beyond those that had occurred in the first hours of the storm, before the light in the barn door window had given people something to move toward. It was late afternoon with the low winter sun beginning its early retreat toward the mountains when Warren Peck stood up. He had been sitting in the barn throughout the digging, helping where he could, speaking very little. He had looked in on Eli twice, standing in the doorway of the cabin each time, without entering, watching his son sleep. And each time he had come back to the barn, with his face arranged in an expression that was not readable from the outside. He stood up and he said to the barn at large, "I need to say something." The barn became quiet. He said it plainly without ceremony because there was no version of what he had to say that benefited from decoration. He said he had received a telegram from his supplier in Denver 10 days before the storm. He said the telegram had warned clearly, and in language that did not require interpretation, that a major weather system was developing, and that anyone in its path should take immediate steps. He said he had put the telegram in his desk drawer and left it there because he had been thinking about his Christmas business, and he had not wanted the town to worry before the holidays. He said I knew. I had the information that could have given every person in this room time to prepare, and I withheld it. And I have no reason for that, which I am willing to speak aloud now, because there is no reason that would hold up in the same room as my son's face this morning. The barn was very still. He looked at the floor. He said, "I am not going to ask for forgiveness because I do not think forgiveness is the appropriate transaction for what I did. I am going to ask to be allowed to stay and help rebuild, and I am going to do that for as long as there is something left to rebuild. And I understand that some of you may never look at me the same way again, and I accept that." He sat back down. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Winifred stood. She stood in the center of the barn, as she had stood that second night when she established the laws of this space, her small frame in the old leather coat, her gray hair still pinned at the base of her neck, with the same pins she had put in 5 days ago, her hands at her sides. She looked at Warren Peck. She said, "Your boy nearly paid for your decision with his life. Live with that until you die. That is not a punishment I am giving you. It is simply what is true, and the truth does not need my help to find you in the night." She let a moment pass. She said, "You will stay. You will work. And you will not make the decision again to hold back information that belongs to the people who have to live with its consequences. Not in this town. Not under any circumstances. Not for Christmas, and not for anything else." She looked around the barn. She said, "All of you will stay. All of you will work. That is the end of this conversation." She sat back down. The barn let out a collective breath, and then slowly began to move again. People rising, speaking in low voices, beginning the incremental practical work of thinking about what came next. The meeting about the town's future happened the following morning, when the cold had not lessened. But the shock had, and the people of Fortune's Reach were sufficiently restored to think beyond the immediate hour. They gathered in the barn, because the barn was the only structure large enough to hold them all, and warm enough to hold the conversation for the time it would take. There were practical matters first. The livery needed to be cleared and assessed. The general store needed to be secured against further weather damage. The hotel was structurally sound and could serve as temporary communal housing until individual homes were assessed and either repaired or deemed unlivable. A committee was needed for supplies, and another for structural assessment, and another for the children and the old and the injured. Winifred assigned these committees with the same economical clarity she had assigned barn duties, and the assignments were received the same way without argument, because the past 5 days had established beyond any reasonable dispute what her judgment was worth. It was after the practical matters were settled that Calvin Morse stood up. He stood up the way a man stands up when he has decided to do something. He has been working himself up to for a while, with the particular deliberateness of a decision that has already been made, but still requires the body to follow through on it. He was wearing a borrowed coat, his own having been lost to the ice, and he held his hat in his hand, which was the hand with the complete set of fingers, because the other hand wrapped in Noyes' careful bandaging was the hand that had paid the price of the first night in a way that would not be undone. He said, "I want to address the matter of leadership." The barn listened. He said he had been the mayor of Fortune's Reach for more than a decade, and he had been in his own estimation, and in the estimation of most people in the room a competent one. He said the town had grown and prospered and been well managed in most of the ways that could be measured. He paused. He said, "I also signed a notice of fine against Winifred Hale in the year '83 for the storage of wood that violated what I described in official language as the aesthetic standards of our growing community. That pile of wood and the 30 years of preparation it represented is the reason every person in this barn is alive today." No one moved. He said, "I stood in Peck's store 3 weeks ago and laughed at Abel Marsh in front of this entire community, and I used my position and my voice to make his warning smaller than it was. I did that because I was comfortable and I was proud, and I had confused the absence of catastrophe with the presence of safety." He looked at his bandaged hand. He said, "I am resigning the mayorship of Fortune's Reach effective today. I am not doing this because I am being asked to, and I am not doing it as a gesture. I am doing it because I am not fit to lead a community through whatever comes next. And I know it, and a man who knows he is not fit for a thing and continues doing it anyway is worse than a man who never knew at all." He looked across the barn at Winifred. He said, "I would like to stay. I would like to work. I would like, if it is permitted by the people of this town, to spend whatever years I have left in Fortune's Reach being the kind of man who earns his place in it, rather than the kind who assumed he already had one." He stood and waited. Winifred looked at him for a long moment across the crowded barn. Then she raised her hand. She said, "I agree to it." There was a pause, and then the rest of the hands went up one by one until all of them were raised, including Abel's at the back and Noyes' beside the door, and last Warren Peck's slowly and without hesitation. Morse sat down. The naming of the new town took less time than the practical committees. Someone said Fortune's Reach was a name that belonged to a way of thinking they were done with the kind of thinking that believed prosperity was a destination you arrived at and stayed in, rather than a condition you maintained by attention and humility and the willingness to prepare for the worst on the days when the worst seemed most unlikely. Several names were suggested. The one that settled was proposed by Francis Hartley, who said it quietly from his seat near the wall. Said it the way a man says something he has been thinking about for a while and is not certain anyone else will agree with, but feels needs to be said. He said, "Winifred's watch." He said, not because she saved us, though she did, but because she never stopped watching when the rest of us closed our eyes. And we need to remember that. Every day when we say the name of where we live, we need to remember what it cost to have someone watching when we were not. The vote was unanimous. Winifred said nothing. She looked at the planks of the barn floor for a moment, at the straw and the boot prints and the accumulated evidence of 5 days of shared survival. Then she looked up and around at the faces of the people who had come through her door in the roaring dark and eaten her food and breathed the air. Her cowl had kept circulating people she had known for years in the careful, distant way of someone who has been politely excluded from the ordinary life of a community people she now knew, in the different and permanent way of people who have been through something together that cannot be undone or forgotten. She said, "All right." She said, "Now let us go see what is left to work with." The weeks that followed were the hardest in terms of the physical labor they required, and the easiest in terms of what they required from the interior life, because when the work is clear, and the purpose is obvious, and every hand is needed, a certain quality of peace becomes available that is not possible in ordinary times. They worked from first light to last light every day. They cleared the streets and assessed the buildings, and made decisions about what could be repaired and what had to come down, and what needed to be rebuilt from the foundation. The livery went up first because the horses that had survived needed shelter, and the horses were essential. Then the general store because supplies were critical, and the distribution of them needed to be centralized somewhere, with walls and a roof. Then the homes, one by one, assessed by a committee that included both Noyes and Winifred, evaluated by practical standard rather than sentiment, prioritized by the families with children and the elderly and those in the most damaged structures. Warren Peck worked. He worked with a thoroughness that no one commented on directly, and everyone noticed. He was first to the labor in the morning and last to leave it in the evening. He did not seek conversation. He did not explain himself further than he had already explained himself. He simply put his hands to whatever was in front of him and kept them there. Eli recovered completely. Children recover in ways that adults do not, with a speed and totality that seem almost unreasonable, as if the body of a child has not yet learned to hold on to what has hurt it. Within a week, he was moving around the barn under his own power, and within 2 weeks he was outside in the cold, with the other children of Fortune's Reach doing what children do when they are given snow and a slope, which is to say, sliding down it repeatedly and loudly, and without any apparent concern for the cold that had nearly killed him. Vera watched him from the barn door and said nothing for a very long time. Then she went inside to help with the midday meal, because that was what needed doing. And she had learned from example that the thing needing doing was the thing to do. Abel Marsh stayed through the winter. He had not announced this plan. He had not announced any plan because he was not a man who made announcements. He simply remained showing up each morning to the work of rebuilding, lending his particular skills in the ways they were useful, moving between tasks with the economical self-direction of someone who does not need to be assigned a purpose to find one. One evening in December, when the rebuilding had progressed enough that there was a general store again and a livery and most of the families were back in their homes, he came to the barn where Winifred was doing her end-of-day accounting. He said, "I am going to stay through the spring, if that is agreeable." She was running her hand along the shelf edge, checking the remaining jars, making the mental calculation of what would need to be replenished before next autumn. She said, "The tool shed bunk is sufficient." He said it is. She said, "Then stay." She went back to counting. By the time the first thaw came, Winifred's watch had changed in ways that were both visible and invisible. The visible changes were in the buildings, which were mostly restored, and in the new structures that had been added. The communal storage facility built behind the town hall, designed on the same principles as Winifred's barn, with the same crosshatch wood stacking, and the same ventilated design, maintained by a committee of 5, with rotating membership and quarterly accounting that was posted publicly on the board outside the post office. The invisible changes were harder to describe, but easier to feel a different quality in how people talked about the seasons and the years and the future. A difference in how they listened. When someone raised a concern. A difference in the silence. Before they responded to things they did not yet understand. Winifred refused every formal title they offered her. She refused the chairmanship of the supply committee, though she agreed to advise it. She refused the position on the town council that was created specifically with her in mind, though she agreed to be consulted before significant decisions were made. She refused the portrait that the hotel owner commissioned to hang in the lobby, which she found excessive, and said so without apology. She remained in her cabin on the 60 acres at the eastern edge of town. She tended her goats. She replanted her kitchen garden in the spring with the same methodical attention she brought to everything working the soil, with her hands pressing seeds into the dark earth, with her thumb in the specific depth. Her experience told her they needed following the sequence that 30 years of practice had made second nature. She began replenishing the barn stores in July. She started with the wood as she always did because the wood was the foundation, and foundations were built first. She arranged the new deliveries and stacked each cord herself, working in the early morning before the day's heat. Built the crosshatch pattern the same as it had always been, each log placed with the same careful attention to the angle and the spacing the air channels maintained throughout. Nell was slower than she used to be. Bess had developed a stiffness in her left foreleg that Winifred tended each morning with a compress, the same kind of focused, practical care she gave to everything that mattered and showed signs of wear. They still lay at the base of the wood stack each morning when she worked, still companionable, still attentive in their sideways animal way, still present in the reliable fashion that had made them over the years the most consistent company she had kept. She talked to them while she counted. She always had. It was on a morning in the second autumn after the storm, a morning very like the one that had opened the story. The aspens turning again, the air carrying the same metallic clarity that autumn air in the high Colorado country carries, that Eli Peck appeared at the fence. He was 10 years old by then, fully restored, taller than he had been with his father's coloring and his mother's directness of gaze. He had come to the fence several times over the past months, drawn by some pull that Winifred had not questioned and had not discouraged, simply acknowledged by her presence and the continuation of whatever she was doing when he arrived. This morning she was counting. She heard him climb the fence rail and settle his weight on the top board, the way children settle onto things not designed as seats, with the comfortable certainty that everything in the world is available to sit on. She heard him watching her. She counted to the end of the cord. She said, without turning 16, "Your turn." There was a pause. Then she heard him drop down from the fence into the yard. She heard him come up beside her. She heard him look at the wood and then at her, and she could feel him trying to understand the system of it, the pattern where to begin. She reached out and placed his hands on the first log. She showed him the angle. She pressed it gently into the correct position and then let go. He placed it. It was not perfect. The angle was slightly off, and the spacing was a little narrow. She adjusted it with one hand, one small correction, and then she moved to the next log and waited. He placed that one too. They worked in silence down the length of the cord, Winifred's hands occasionally reaching to correct, never to take over the boy's hands. Learning by doing the only thing hands truly learn, by which is the work itself. Nell came around the end of the stack and settled against Winifred's leg, and Bess lay down in the dry grass behind them. and the morning moved at the pace mornings move in that country, when there is no wind, which is to say slowly with complete indifference to what anyone might want from it. When they reached the end of the cord, Eli stepped back and looked at what they had built together. He said, "Why does it have to go like this?" The crossing part. Winifred looked at the stack. She said, "Because wood has to breathe. Seal it too tight, and it rots from the inside before you ever know something is wrong." He considered this for a moment with the serious attention that children sometimes give to things that seem to mean more than they are saying. He said, "Is that true for other things too?" She looked at him. She said yes. He nodded the way children nod when they have received information they intend to keep. She handed him the next log. He placed it. She had counted for 30 years. Now she taught.